Good morning and welcome to another wonderful lecture of the Dorothy Marie Lowry Distinguished Guest Lecture Series. We're so excited. I'm so excited that you're here this morning. This morning, we're going to take a unique tour, or I guess a unique talk, spend some time with art thefts. This week's guest lecturer is Dr. Laura Evans. Laura Evans is a distinguished teaching professor and the director of the Arts Museum Education Certificate at the University of North Texas. She teaches about art museums, art interpretation, and art crime. She is inspired by how we can learn about ourselves, others, and the world through the world, looking at and talking about art together. Evans received her PhD in art education at the Ohio State University, a master's in museum studies at the University of Toronto, and a bachelor's in arts history and English at Denison University. And she has taught abroad in Finland, Brazil, and New Zealand. Evans has worked at art museums throughout the world, from the Perth Institute of Contemporary Arts in Western Australia to the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., with many more in between. She has collaborated with museums around the country, such as the Kimball Museum of Art in Fort Worth and the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles, to provide trainings, which is how I met her, and she's wonderful. Evans has a special interest in art crime, thefts, vandalism, and forgeries. Evans studied art crime at the Association of Research into Crimes Against Art in Italy and has a postgraduate degree in antiquities, trafficking, and art crime from the University of Glasgow. She lectures about art globally by land and sea. In 2022, she led the first overland art crime trip through Europe for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and with a second one planned through Italy and Malta for 2024. Evans is currently writing the Atlas of Art Crime, which will be published by Pastel and part of the Penguin Random House publications, and is due to come out in fall of 2024. So unfortunately, she is unable to be with us live. However, we had the ability to pre-record her lecture, and I'm sure you will enjoy it.
So well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Evans, for joining us this morning. Take it away.
Okay, I'm going to talk to myself while I share my screen. There we go. I hope you can all see that. It is really nice to be with you all today. I teach a graduate class on Friday at the time you're probably watching this. So I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in real time on Zoom to meet you and see your faces. Speaking of faces, this lecture is about a face that we will come to find out is a very memorable one indeed. And it might seem like this lecture is just about a theft, but I have crammed a bunch of other art crimes into this time together. And you'll absolutely hear about our titular theft, certainly, but you'll also hear about other art thefts, forgeries, and vandalism that all intersect with this theft we're here to talk about today. But first, let's talk about our weeping woman here and the time that she went missing. So, get out your Texas Instrument calculator because it's time to jump back to 1986, the year that Chernobyl reactor exploded, Phantom of the Opera debuted, the Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated after launching, and it's the year I turned 6. Check out my Annie-inspired perm. It's also the year that the Weeping Woman would be stolen. But first, a short pit stop into December of 1985. This is Patrick McCackey. Well, it's a painting of Patrick McCackey, the director of the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne, Australia, or Melbourne. And we're going to call the museum NGV for short. And yes, every time you see an image of Makaki in this lecture, he will be wearing a different colored pocket square and a different colored bow tie, kind of like his hallmark features. So even though I'm showing you a painting of Makaki right now, I can assure you that you will know who he is in any of the following images, because he will always be the one with the pocket square and the bow tie. Like his accoutrement choices, Makaki was known to be a very colorful chap with a rather charming stutter when he got nervous. And he brought a lot of like vim and vigor to the NGV during his tenure. So it was with great fanfare that Makaki announced on December 5th, 1985, that the museum had purchased their very first Picasso, and only the third Picasso in all of Australia. The painting is called The Weeping Woman, and here she is in all of her glory. We have a woman, her face fragmented and distorted by grief. Her eyes are mismatched, her nose disjointed, her eyebrows are furrowed, and her teeth are sharp razor spikes. The tears streaming down her face, the stark outlines of her face and her hair, her raw nose from crying too much, and her handkerchief clutched in her hand, emphasized this shattering grief. The acidic greens, the unsettling purples and harsh blacks make this face a jarring face. It is unsettling. We feel her grief and sadness. It is visceral. She is suffering. But why? We will get into that in a minute. The painting was bought for 1.6 Australian dollars, the highest price paid for a work of art in all of Australia at the time. It beat out the previous most expensive piece, a Jackson Pollock called Blue Coals, bought for a piddly $300,000 in 1973. With currency fluctuations and the dropping of the Australian dollar in 1986, the Weeping Woman's price skyrocketed up to $2 million. And the painting was backed by the Australian government. They were the ones putting up the money, and that high price tag really rubbed some Australians the wrong way. You know, this is public money. It was going to something that not all Australians found valuable or even aesthetically pleasing or important to them. But, you know, public be damned, the NGV called it their most important 20th century acquisition. And we'll get into why it was considered to be so important in a bit here. Because there had been this huge dust up over the Jackson Pollock purchase in 1973, and at the time, this enormous public debate over the literal and figurative art, pun intended there, value of abstract art, I imagine Patrick Makaki anticipated that his pricey Picasso purchase, that's a lot of P's, would invoke as much spirited discussion within Australian discourse. Maybe because of this expectation that Picasso's woman could ruffle some feathers, he chose to unveil the Picasso thusly by saying at a press conference in 1985, quote, "This face is going to haunt Melbourne for the next 100 years. Everyone will come to know it very well indeed, I hope." In an interview at the unveiling of the painting in December of 85, Makaki said this.
And we'd be terribly lucky if it went without any brouhaha at all. No, I mean, you know, someone asked me earlier today, we live in a Philistine nation, but a civilized city. So we're lucky here.
So I'll just repeat what he says in that clip. He says, quote, "We'd be terribly lucky if it," meaning the exhibition of this painting, The Weeping Woman, "went without any brouhaha." Someone asked me earlier today, we live in a Philistine nation, but a civilized city. So we are lucky here, end quote. And I want to focus on the quote, we'd be terribly lucky if it went without any brouhaha, end quote, with his famous last words. It hasn't yet been 100 years, but what would happen 8 months later after that press conference in August of 1986 still continues to haunt Melbourne and all of Australia as it remains, spoiler alert, in my humble opinion, Australia's greatest unsolved art heist. As McCaughey would no doubt reflect after predicting that the Picasso would haunt Melbourne, hindsight is 2020. But McCaughey also had some foresight, just not enough. On July 28th, 1986, just 5 days before the Weeping Woman would be plucked from the NGV's walls, Melbourne's local newspaper, The Age, ran a story about recent art thefts around the world. There had just been a catastrophic art theft of about $20 million that had happened in Paris in October of 1985 at the Musée Marmottan. And McCaughey would later say in an interview that the article made his blood freeze as he realized an armed gang could easily do the same at his museum. And he claims that he immediately tightened security at the NGV, but as we will see, maybe not tight enough. Something McCaughey hadn't done was insure the Weeping Woman. And I know I can hear you internally groaning, even though you're not there as I'm giving this lecture. You're thinking it, she's thinking it, he's thinking it, I'm thinking it, like what a dumb move, right? You know, but McCaughey said he lived in a civilized city. What could possibly happen to a Picasso painting in a civilized city? Fast forward to The Weeping Woman, debuted on the walls of the NGV. And on Monday, August 4th, 1986, a guard noticed that she was missing. But not to worry, she'd been replaced with the sort of registration card used at the museum to document their collection. And a fake card had been placed on the wall where the painting once hung, and the card announced that the painting had been removed for routine maintenance with the initials ACT at the bottom of the card. And in Australia, ACT often stands for Australian Capital Territory. And as such, museum staff thought that the painting had been moved to the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra, in the Australian Capital Territory, or the ACT. The National Gallery in Canberra was run. Hey, do you have the Picasso at your museum? No, they did not have the Picasso. So museum's conservationist was called. Hey, do you have the Picasso upstairs in your labs? No, he did not. And when it finally dawned on museum staff that the Picasso was officially unaccounted for, McCaughey was called out of a meeting, and he later wrote in his memoir that when he heard the news, he immediately began searching the museum, hoping that it was all a prank and the painting had been hidden in the building. The police were called, and 30 recruits, along with museum staff, searched the museum. As one newspaper headline later put it, that Monday, there were lots of red faces frantically searching the museum for a green face. Almost immediately, the painting's frame was found on the top of a temporary wall. Hearts sunk. The removal of the frame signified two things. Number one, this was not a prank. Number two, the painting was unprotected. And as we know, frames serve as imperfect armor for paintings. And without its frame, the Weeping Woman was certainly more prone to damage. Police determined that the painting had been swiped after hours on Saturday, August 2nd. Mind you, this was discovered on Monday, August 4th. So the painting was missing for about a little less than 48 hours. And the police determined that the thief or thieves knew their way around art, as the painting was anchored to the wall with really distinctive screws that would have required a specialty screwdriver that was not, something you could go and buy at the hardware store. It was only available to specialists. The same morning that the painting was discovered missing, and nearly, 48 hours after it was taken, the local newspaper, The Age, received a ransom note. So had a certain government official. And we'll get into that again in a moment here. The thieves clearly knew their way around art because of the specialized screwdriver and the fake registrar card, but it's clear to me that they also knew their art crime history. Nearly 75 years earlier, on August 21st, 1911, the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre. And the mastermind of that scheme was Vincenzo Peruggia, who was a handyman for the museum, and he'd even built the frame for the Mona Lisa. And he was under this mistaken delusion that Napoleon and the country of France had stolen the Mona Lisa from her home country of Italy, where Da Vinci was from, which was not how it happened, but that's what he believed. So along with two accomplices, they snuck into the Louvre wearing their white workman's smocks on a Sunday evening, and they hid in a tiny, narrow storeroom overnight. Waiting until morning, they slipped out of the closet, lifted her 200-pound glass case off the wall, stripped her of it and her frame, and wrapped the panel and in a blanket, and as inconspicuously as possible, hustled off to the train station, where they caught a 7:47 a.m. train out of the city into their home on the outskirts of Paris. And much like the Picasso theft in Melbourne, it was 28 hours later before anyone even noticed that the Mona Lisa was missing. The Louvre was not exactly known, like the NGV in Melbourne, for their sterling security. Months before the Mona Lisa was stolen, a French reporter had even spent the night in a sarcophagus in the Louvre just to highlight the museum's terrible security. 8 days after the Mona Lisa was snatched, the former secretary of the poet here, Guillaume Apollinaire, he marched into a Parisian police office and admitted to stealing minor works of art from the Louvre over a period of several years. And though he insisted he hadn't stolen the Mona Lisa, he did mention that he had sold a few pieces of Iberian sculpture to a famous painter. You guessed it, that famous painter interested in Iberian art was, of course, the most famous Spanish artist in Paris, nay, the most famous artist in the world, probably at that time. And after police searched Apollinaire's apartment, Picasso, who had two sculptures in his own apartment that had stamps on the bottom reading "Property of the Musée du Louvre," panicked. And he thought about throwing them into the river, but he couldn't bring himself to drown works of art. Fearing deportation, Picasso anonymously turned the sculptures into a newspaper. But eventually, Picasso and Apollinaire ended up in court. Their performance there was like some surrealist work of performance art. Cracking under the pressure of the court, Apollinaire admitted to everything. He admitted he'd hidden stolen artifacts, he had harbored a suspect, his former secretary, and he'd even obstructed the investigation. And Picasso, usually this like poster child for macho confidence, crumbled in court. Tears streamed down his face. He claimed to absurdly never have even met Apollinaire. And faced with these like bizarre and conflicting statements, the judge tossed the case out and released both men with just a stern warning. The Mona Lisa would eventually be recovered 28 months after the theft in Florence. After the theft, it was recovered in Florence. And the judge that tried Vincenzo Peruggia's case would not be as lenient as he was to Apollinaire and Picasso. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison. The only thing that could have convinced me more that the thieves knew about the Mona Lisa theft is if they could have waited a few more weeks And instead of stealing the Picasso on August 2nd, they had stolen it on August 21st. Then we would have had this perfect synergy, and I could officially proclaim August 21st to be International Art Theft Day. It would have been the day the Mona Lisa was stolen in 1911. It would have been the day Francisco Goya's, the Duke of Wellington, was stolen from London's National Gallery in 1961, and the day that Picasso's Weeping Woman was stolen. But alas, that's not how it happened. August 21st is not yet a public holiday, but please, keep that in mind if you're planning a future art heist. Good to know your history there. So, like I mentioned earlier, the day that the MGV realized its star painting was missing, a local newspaper had also received a ransom note. Not only did the newspaper get this letter, a copy was also sent to the Australian arts minister, a man named Race Matthews. And I would like to read you the whole ransom letter because it is comedy gold. Most art thieves are not also comedians, but whoever was behind this theft had a florid, indulgent, and rather wicked writing style with a petty, dry, irreverent, and ironic sense of humor. And it puts all other ransom notes in the history of art crime to shame, including the rather hilarious ones by Kempton Button in the theft of Goya's Duke of Wellington in 1961. If you've seen The Duke, the movie that came out a few years ago, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I present to you the first ransom letter in its original typewritten form, though it has 12 words that were removed by the police. So I do not know what those words are. Here we go. Attention, rank Matthews. So let me pause to remind you that the Australian arts minister is named Race, R-A-C-E, Matthews. So already we have a strong start from the thieves. This opener tells us they are not holding back. I'll continue. We have stolen the Picasso from the National Gallery as a protest against the niggardly funding of the fine arts in this hick state and against the clumsy, unimaginative stupidity of the administration and distribution of that funding. And just allow me to pause here and say that if you were shocked about that use of the word niggardly there, let me clarify that niggardly is an adjective that goes back to the 14th century and comes from the Middle East. And it's a word meaning stingy or miserly. Yeah, just wanted to make sure that we all know very different words. Back to the letter. 2 conditions must be publicly agreed upon if the painting is to be returned. The minister must announce a commitment to increasing the funding of the arts by 10% in real terms over the next 3 years, and must agree to appoint an independent committee to inquire into the mechanics of the funding of the arts with a view to releasing money from its administration and making it available to artists. Oops, sorry, I went too fast. So we have here, actually, I think I messed my slides up a little bit. There we go. The prize is to be called the Picasso ransom. Sorry, I missed that part. Okay, so here we have some clues as to who might be behind the theft. Presumably, we have someone who is invested in growing and sustaining the arts in Australia. They're asking for more money for the arts, oversight over to how that money is shared, and that an annual prize be established for young artists with a great name, the Picasso ransom. And I think I did something funny with my slides there. So I'll just say, I don't think I read the full script there. The minister must announce a new annual prize for painting open to artists under 30 years of age. 5 prizes of $5,000 should be rewarded. Fund is to be established to ensure that the real value of the prizes is maintained each year. And then the giveaway, Picasso ransom. The letter continues. Because the Minister of the Arts is also the Minister of flawed, we are allowing him a sporting 7 days in which to try to have us arrested while he deliberates. There will be no negotiation. At the end of 7 days, if our demands have not been met, the painting will be destroyed and our campaign continues. Ouch. Burn. And there is a double entendre in that word. You will get it by the end of the lecture, but it's a burn in that they've insulted Race Matthews by calling him the minister of flawed. And again, it's a burn that you will get in a little bit here. The letter is signed, your very humble servants, Australian cultural terrorists. So there we have it. The ACT stands for Australian Cultural Terrorists. And upon reading that ransom note, police rushed to ascertain if there was really a group of terrorists known by such a name in Australia, and they came up empty-handed. It appeared that the ACT had just been dreamed up for the Picasso theft. And y'all, things are going to get so much crazier and funnier in this story. But before I go into the details of the theft, I want to take this opportunity to do a little detour into the background of the Weeping Woman and the man, the myth, the legend, Picasso, and the woman we should all really know more about, the Weeping Woman herself, Dora Maar. And why would someone or someones go to the trouble to steal this particular painting by this particular artist? Sure, stealing a Picasso is going to get you a lot more attention than, say, stealing a lesser Spanish artist like Juan Gris. No offense to him, of course. And stealing one of Picasso's Weeping Women paintings, of which there are 4 other oil paintings, is going to get you a lot more attention than, say, stealing a rather inconsequential Picasso drawing. And even more than that, stealing a Picasso painting that the nation of Australia has spent $2 million on is going to get you the most attention. So why did Australia spend a couple of $1 million on this piece? Why is it so important to the history of art? Let's get into it. While Pablo Picasso is best known by his last name, his full name is 25 words long. At his baptism, Picasso was christened Pablo, and I don't speak Spanish, I only speak Italian, so please bear with me. Pablo Diego Jose Francisco de Paula Juan Nepomuceno Maria de los Remedios Cipriano de la Santísima Trinidad Martyr Patricio Lito Ruiz y Picasso. Whew. It's no wonder that when he made it, people often just referred to him as Picasso. And to try to understand him, you have to look at him like you might look at one of his Cubist paintings. And I need to peer at it from all sides to put together the pieces into what resembles a person. A very imperfect, but wildly talented and productive person. Picasso was as multi-dimensional of an artist as his Cubist paintings attempted to show. He did neoclassical, he had his blue period, had his Freud period, he stole from African art, he was one of the inventors of Cubism, he was a radical political artist, he was a sculptor, he was a painter, he was a printmaker, he was a ceramicist, and more. And he used about any and every material you can imagine. To make it simple, I'll just say that he could draw and paint just about anything and in any style. And it seems that he was always deemed to be an artist. He was born in Malaga, Spain in 1881. And according to Picasso's proud mother, her son's first word was "is," slang for lápiz, pencil in Spanish. His proud father, Jose Ruiz, middling artist and curator, thought that his son might be interested in art. So he started to teach Picasso drawing at the age of 7. And by the age of 12, Picasso had so far exceeded his father's skills that his dad hung up his smock, passed his paintbrushes to his son, and never painted again. And since his dad was done with Picasso's artistic training, he started bringing Picasso to brothels for a very different kind of education. And art and sex would be two constant obsessions for the rest of Picasso's life. And Picasso was a mama's boy. He was constantly surrounded by women, his mother, 4 aunts, 2 sisters, lots of female cousins, and the aforementioned sex workers. And as a teen, he started signing his work not by Ruiz, his father's last name, but by Picasso, his mother's surname. And by 13, Picasso was enrolled in art school with a bunch of 20-somethings. Eventually, he moved to Barcelona, to Madrid, and to Paris. He moved through all those colorful periods and along into Cubism, eventually alongside his friend and co-founder of Cubism, Georges Braque, who's kind of been forgotten by popular culture. And Picasso went through women like he went through art styles. I do not have the time or frankly the energy to go through all of his wives and mistresses, but I imagine most of you are aware of the Lothario that Picasso was. He used women in many ways, one of which was as models and muses. And he always had a lot of women in his orbit, and most of them ended up in tears. So you may be wondering who the inspiration for the Weeping Woman was. That woman was one of his mistresses, Dora Maar. And Picasso met Maar when he was with another mistress, Marie-Therese Walter, with whom he had a daughter, Maya. Picasso met Marie-Therese when she was 17. He was 45, and he was married to his first wife at the time. You'll notice a pattern here. The story of how Maar and Picasso met has a few different origin stories. But the one I'll repeat here is that they met at a cafe in Paris in 1935. Maar was 28, Picasso was 54. And Maar was seated alone at a cafe, and she was playing a game with a small little penknife, where she had her hand on the table, and she would try to stab the knife between her spread fingers as fast as possible. And occasionally she would nick herself with the knife. She had gloves on that were embroidered with red roses, and so the gloves would become a little bloody from the times that she would nick herself. And her sadistic little game caught the attention of one Pablo Picasso, and Picasso asked to be introduced to her, and after he asked to keep Maar's bloodied glove. And I've read various interpretations of this meet cute, as the kids would call it, and some have compared Picasso and Maar's first meeting to that of like a bullfight, with Maar as the bull and the toreador, and Picasso as like the rapt audience. However they really met, Picasso and Maar would go on to have a torrid affair, all while Picasso was still with Marie-Therese, mind you. And Maar would become his public mistress, and Marie-Therese would be his private mistress. And Dora Maar was an extraordinary artist in her own right, even though she is sadly most well known as Picasso's muse, or not remembered at all. It took her local newspaper 10 days to report her death in 1997. She was born Theodora Markovich. She grew up in Europe and in South America, where she became interested in art. And in Paris, she studied painting, but she soon fell in love with photography. She opened her own studio in 1931 and changed her name to Dora Maar. Maar's photos could be editorial, imaginative, socially conscious, political. And unsettling. She was one of the few women photographers to be included in the notoriously sexist group of surrealists. So she was a well-respected artist, but she was eclipsed by the supernova that was her lover, Picasso. And a few years into their relationship, Picasso was commissioned by the Spanish Republican government to create a mural for the Spanish Pavilion at the 1937 Paris International Exposition. And uninspired, Picasso spent 4 months sketching a mural depicting an artist's studio. On Monday, April 26th of 1937, Guernica, a small village in the Basque region of Spain, considered to be the headquarters of the Republican resistance movement, was bombed mercilessly for 2 hours at the behest of Franco's nationalists by their allies, the Nazis and fascist Italian forces. Monday was market day in Guernica, so most villagers were gathered in the center of town. 1/3 of Guernica's 5,000 inhabitants were killed or wounded. Most of them were women and children, as most of the town's men were fighting for the Republican Army. And Picasso read an eyewitness account of the bombing in the newspapers and saw photographs of the tragic scene. And a Spanish poet friend visited Picasso and pressed him to make his mural about the bombing. And Mar, who was extremely liberal and very political, encouraged him to do the same. So instead of focusing on artillery or soldiers, Picasso chose to paint the bombing's innocent victims. We see a mother on the left holding her dead child and crying out in pain. We see a woman on the far right, hands up to the heavens, wailing as a house burns behind her. We see a woman rushing in from the right side, her eyes up to the skies. We see a woman in the center, most likely modeled on Dora Maar, peering out a window with an oil lamp, so dark skies. So with an oil lamp, that because the skies are so dark from the bombing. We see a dead soldier on the ground, a frightened horse with a hole in its side, a thunderstruck bull, and a bird squawking in the upper left corner. And once he knew what he wanted to paint, it took Picasso only 35 days to finish the mural. Mar was the one to find a studio large enough for Picasso to paint the almost 11-foot tall and 25-foot wide painting. And she was the only person he allowed to document his progress. So we have these wonderful photos of how Guernica took shape and changed. Even before Guernica, Mar's black and white photography may have played some role in Picasso's choice of a color palette and in the flatness of the figures of the piece. And Mar he allowed her to contribute by painting some of the horse's hairs. From the painting of Guernica, we get one story that exemplifies how Picasso treated the women in his life. While he was painting Guernica in his studio with Mar at his side, his other mistress, Marie-Thérèse, came to visit, and Mar objected to her presence. According to Marianne Cause, who wrote a biography of Mar's life, this is what transpired. Marie-Thérèse said, quote, "I have a child by this man. It's my place to be here with him. You can leave right now." Dora replied, "I have as much reason as you have to be here. I haven't borne him a child, but I don't see what difference that makes." Picasso kept on painting while they kept on arguing. And then according to Picasso, he recalled that finally, quote, "Marie-Thérèse turned to me and said, 'Make up your mind, which one of us goes?'" He says, "It was a hard decision to make. I liked them both for different reasons. Marie-Thérèse because she was sweet and gentle and did whatever I wanted her to, and Dora because she was intelligent. I told them they'd have to fight it out themselves, so they began to wrestle." This must have amused or pleased Picasso, as he would later sum up the incident as, quote, "one of my choicest memories." Hannah Gadsby is a comedian who studied art history at university in Australia. And she was also the curator of the Brooklyn Museum's exhibition titled, quote, "It's Pablo-matic," Picasso, according to Hannah Gadsby. And it was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Picasso's death last year. Gadsby is no fan of Picasso, and she put it thusly in her Netflix comedy special, Nanette, from 2018. So she is quoting Picasso here in this clip.
Each time I leave a woman, I should burn her. Destroy the woman, you destroy the past she represents. Ah, the greatest artist of the 20th century.
Back to 1937, Guernica was shown to great effect at the Paris International Exposition, launching Picasso into being not just a great artist overall, but now a great political artist. And the government of the Spanish Republic acquired Guernica from Picasso in the same year, 1937. But when World War II broke out, Picasso decided that Guernica should remain in the custody of the Museum of Modern Art in New York City for safekeeping until the war ended. And in 1958, Picasso extended the loan to the MoMA for an indefinite period until democracy had been restored in Spain. And the painting did eventually finally return to Spain in 1981, where it's now at the Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, and it has its own special room. During its sojourn at the MoMA, Guernica had a little run-in with an art vandal in 1974. On February 28th, a man named Tony Shafrazi pulled out a can of spray paint and tagged Picasso's painting with the words, "Kill lies all." The nearly 40 other visitors in the gallery who had witnessed this act were aghast. The words were a foot high and cherry red. And Shafrazi later said that he intended the phrase "kill lies all" to be read right to left or left to right in an homage to James Joyce, which honestly, I cannot explain what that means to you. And I feel like the people that could explain why "Kill Lies All" connects to James Joyce and Tony Shafrazi is this book club in California who spent 28 years reading Finnegan's Wake, one of James Joyce's books, and who, after finishing it last year, announced that the next book for the book club is, surprise, it's Finnegan's Wake again. So yeah, after reading about 2 pages per month for 28 years, they are going to read it again. So we may need them to explain to us this backwards forward reading of "Kill Lies All." Back to 1974 and Guernica at the MoMA. As guards descended on the vandal, Shafrazi, who was an Iranian-American artist, shouted, "Call the curator, I'm an artist." And then he proceeded to spell his name for the crowd as he was escorted from the gallery. So somebody wanted attention. He was interrogated in the museum's bathroom and later in a police precinct. And he claimed that he defaced the painting because he was an artist and needed to tell the truth. What truth he was trying to tell has been open to speculation in the ensuing years. And though the MoMA hadn't wanted any publicity after the event for fear of repeat vandals, Shafrazi had called the Associated Press before his stunt. So as a result, Shafrazi's artwork was featured on the front page of the Daily News with the subheading, quote, "Now Showing American Graffiti," which is a really good headline pun because American Graffiti, the film, had debuted just the year before. The painting was unharmed thanks to a very thick layer of varnish, and conservators were able to just wipe away the spray paint with a solvent, and a few particles that were stuck on, they were able to pick off with surgical needles. Shafrazi was ordered to serve 5 years of probation for criminal mischief. And the judge in his trial asked Shafrazi if he would do it again. And Shafrazi said it would be crazy to repeat an act like that. the judge, I don't know, thinking maybe he was showing that he was sorry, asked Shafrazi why, and Shafrazi said, because I did it already. So I guess you can't argue with that logic. And Shafrazi's premeditated act helped catapult him into the art world's elite. He went on to achieve great success as the owner of a gallery, which specialized in the work of, ironically, graffiti artists like Basquiat and Keith Haring. And Shafrazi continued to dine out on his fame as the Guernica Vandal, as seen here. In 2008, at an after party for one of Shafrazi's exhibitions, Shafrazi was presented with a cake that featured a reproduction of Guernica on top, and with a tube of red frosting, he wrote in big letters, "I'm sorry, not." Sorry, I couldn't help slipping into another little tangent into the history of art crime, vandalism. So I'm sorry for the diversion, not. Maybe around now, you're probably wondering, why the heck am I talking so much about Guernica? You might be thinking to yourself, isn't this lecture about a completely different Picasso painting in Australia? What are we doing here? Well, fasten your seatbelt. We are circling back around. We talked about how Dora Maar documented Picasso's progress of painting Guernica. We also talked about how she helped paint some of the horse in the background. We talked about Dora Maar's political leanings. She was a devout proponent of anti-fascism and far more politically engaged than Picasso. She was distraught over the bombing of Guernica. And the painting, Guernica, is really focused on the immediate aftermath of the bombing. The people in it are simply reacting to the shock of being showered by bombs. They are in that moment. And Picasso, after he finished it, he became really obsessed with like what would happen if you pressed play on Guernica. Specifically, what would happen if you press play on one of these women. So this became an obsession, and he kept wanting to explore the human suffering in the aftermath of the bombing, and in particular, this face of the weeping woman drowning in grief. And he used Maar as his model. And here is one of those paintings he made. He would make 4, like I said earlier, and numerous drawings of the weeping woman and in the weeks and months after Guernica. And this one is at the Tate, is in the Tate's collection, and it is considered to be, quote unquote, the best of the weeping woman, with Melbourne's as the second best. The other 2 paintings are very close to y'all, one's at the LACMA and one's at the Musée Picasso in Paris. And they've been called like a postscript to Guernica. And I want to read a quote from Ruth Millington's book called Muse, Uncovering the Hidden Figures Behind Art History's Masterpieces. And she wrote this about the Tate painting, quote, "With this work, the screaming woman, feeling Guernica, had become a weeping woman, engulfed in grief. Picasso's weeping woman cries and cries, with no end in sight. Agony is etched into her face, defined by jagged lines. The handkerchief stuffed into her mouth appears like a shard of glass, and her black dress is the universal symbol of mourning. The weeping woman is an evocation of overwhelming anguish caused by the atrocities of war. It encapsulates Maar's compassion for human suffering, which she had photographed continually and sympathetically in her own work. In this portrait, it's almost as if she is crying in grief at others' pain," end quote. The eventual buyer of this painting and Picasso's biographer, Roland Penrose, would say of it, quote, "The result of using color in a manner so totally unassociated with grief, for a face in which sorry is evident in every line, is highly disconcerting, as though the tragedy had arrived without warning." So Roland Penrose bought this weeping woman for 250 pounds at the time, and it, too, was stolen. along with 25 other paintings from his personal home in London on April 7th, 1969. Of all the stolen items, Penrose most keenly felt the loss of the weeping woman. Of it, he said, quote, "My most prized picture was a Picasso called A Woman Weeping, which I bought just after he painted it. It was my most treasured possession. I bought it when the paint was still wet." And the paintings were all found by construction workers at a house in London that was about to be demolished. Feels very fitting that Penrose recalls that when he was informed of the painting's safety, he wept. After the theft, Penrose wisely offered the painting to the Tate for safekeeping. So that's where we'll find it now. So it seems that the Weeping Woman is an attractive painting to steal, first in London, then Melbourne. Picasso would later say, quote, "Dora for me was always a weeping woman. For years, I've painted her in tortured forms, not through sadism and not with pleasure either, just obeying a vision that forced itself on me." Mar was not a fan of this Miss Havisham-like comparison. After their relationship spontaneously combusted, Mar would go on to say, quote, "All Picasso's portraits of me are lies. Not one is Dora Maar." And after their split in 1943, Dora Maar would also say about Picasso that he was, quote, "an extraordinary artist, but morally worthless." Their 8-year relationship was a whirlwind of passion and pain. And in 1943, at the age of 62, Picasso left Dora for a 21-year-old. This betrayal hit Dora hard, plunging her into despair and depression. Her friends feared for her well-being. They witnessed her public meltdowns. She contemplated suicide. She ended up receiving electroshock therapy in a psychiatric facility. She later underwent psychoanalysis with Jacques Lacan, who encouraged her to find a spiritual practice. And she became intensely devoted to Catholicism and increasingly reclusive in her later years. And while their paths did diverge pretty dramatically, Picasso and Maar maintained occasional contact. They would exchange gifts. And Picasso, being Picasso, would be sometimes cruel in his gift giving. And so after he died, they found a gift for Dora Maar in his studio, and they offered it to her, and she refused unopened. She didn't want the gift. And what was inside was a ring, and it was beautiful on the surface, but hidden inside the ring was a spike, so it could never be worn. And I think that gift says a lot about the gift giver. When she died, like I said before, it took her local newspaper 10 days to even publish an obituary. And even then, most obituaries only mentioned her for being a muse to Picasso. But I hope I've shown in the short bit about her that Maar was so much more than that. And if you want to learn more about Dora Maar, I would recommend this book called Finding Dora Maar, which came out in 2020, actually published by the Getty Press. The author is an art historian, and she just randomly bought an old address book on eBay, just like sight unseen. And when it arrived, she noticed that all of the addresses were handwritten, and they were the names of famous artists all throughout Paris in the first half of the 1900s. And she eventually realized that the address book had belonged to Dora Maar. So she ended up constructing this biography of Maar using the address book as the starting point. And it's this really refreshing perspective to this idea that Maar was just, Picasso's weeping woman. Okay, I hope you took your Dramamine for today's lecture, because we are whipping forward in time again. And now we are finally returning to Australia and to the stolen weeping woman of the NGV. When we were last there, the weeping woman had been discovered stolen on August 4th, Monday. The media had just gotten a hold of a devastating ransom note that made it clear that the thieves were no fans of the Australian Minister of the Arts, Rhys Matthews. And they were peeved that so much public money would be spent on a dead foreign artist rather than on cultivating the living arts scene in Australia. And they proposed 2 conditions for the return of the Picasso. There must be a 10% increase in funding for the arts over 3 years, and they must start an annual paid art prize for young artists called the Picasso Ransom. The letter was signed, the Australian Cultural Terrorists. Monday afternoon, the NGV's director, Patrick McCackey, seen here in the bow tie, of course, held a press conference. At it, he expressed he was horrified and stunned by the theft. He refused to confirm or deny that the painting was insured. It wasn't. I know, we're still groaning to ourselves about it. Like, how stupid, how silly not to insure that painting. But it happens all the time in the history of art crime. And to be fair to the NGV, the cost of insuring that Picasso and the rest of the gallery's collection would have accounted for their entire annual budget. So it was kind of a damned if you don't, damned if you don't situation. And as Rhys Matthews, the Australian arts minister, would later point out to the thieves, it was very ironic that the Picasso would ensure that the Picasso would be insured in the future and at the expense of the arts budget. So the thieves maybe didn't think that one all the way through. At the press conference, McCackey claimed that the security, though, had not been lax, and he said this.
What they've done, if the picture is damaged or ruined in any way, then this gallery will never be able to afford another Picasso painting.
Cut off there, but he said, we'll never be able to afford another Picasso painting if this piece is damaged or doesn't return. And at another press conference, Rhys Matthews, who you're going to get to meet here in this clip, the arts minister added this.
Imagine that anybody who had genuinely at heart the interest either of art or of art lovers would have perpetrated an action of this sort.
He's calling those thieves out for not really being true art lovers. And Rhys, in his press conference, said the museum's security had been lax. And so McCackey responded immediately by implementing strict new security measures at the NGV. He removed the guards' chairs so that they could no longer sit down on the job, the implication being that sitting would make them less vigilant. And he said, you're no longer allowed to chat with one another either. And the 70 guards, who had literally and figuratively just had their chairs yanked from underneath them, promptly replied by going on strike. The museum was forced to close for 3 full days in the midst of all of this. And an agreement was eventually reached. The guards would get all of their chairs -5. And the museum reopened to throngs of visitors who were all eager to see the place where the weeping woman was missing. So just, they were there to see the blank wall. And there were a few different theories about what the ACT would do with the painting if their ransom demands weren't met. So I'm gonna play you this clip from an Australian news program about some of those theories.
With me a little earlier this evening was Sue Hewitt, Australian representative of Christie's. Miss Hewitt, if the ransom isn't achieved, what would be done with the painting?
Well, of course, I do hope they're not going to do what they suggest they're going to do, but alternatively, I would
destroy it.
That's destroyed, yes. I think that they would probably take it out of the country.
Well, who'd buy it then?
I think it'd have to be sold really through a sort of rather unscrupulous dealer, because certainly it couldn't come up for auction because it's too public. We prepare our catalogues, illustrate them. We also would know about the history of the painting. You see, most of Picasso's works are well documented, you see, and it would be identifiable.
Are there dealers who are well-known fencers?
I'm sure there are.
So you've no doubt there would be a market for it.
Oh, yes, but it's certainly nothing like its true market value.
What What happens then? Does it have to be viewed in a locked room with no one present? What value would the purchaser ever get from it?
Well, I suppose a certain amount of a feeling of pride in owning something. Oh, of course, they can't share it with their friends, but it does happen. So it's not an unusual occurrence.
And people buy a painting that they know to be stolen and then lock it away somewhere themselves.
Absolutely.
What are the physical problems of it? It's on a stretcher, we understand. Does it then get rolled up and slipped under the shoes and suitcase?
Well, certainly it'd have to be rolled up but the problem is the paint. You know, if you are rolling it too tight, you could actually crack the paint and then eventually it would fall off. So it is very, very difficult to roll a canvas for any length of time. I mean, you've got to think it's 24 hours to get out of the country, really, in a suitcase.
Do most people who've been involved with this sort of thing have the conservative skills to get the painting out without damaging?
Well, we've got to believe that these people are artists or in the art world, and so therefore they would have a certain knowledge of looking after paintings.
Well, finally, what would you do if it came Christie's way?
I'd ring the police, of course.
Thanks very much.
I'd ring the police, of course. I'm suspicious of Sue. I think she's in on it. No, I'm just kidding. As you heard, experts at the time suspected that the members of the ACT were involved in the arts in some way. And if their demands weren't met, people thought they might sell the painting to an unscrupulous dealer or a fence, of which Sue Hewitt assured us there are many. I can also assure you that there are some too in the history of art crime for sure, but I'll save that for another lecture. She also tells us that there are collectors out there who would buy the stolen painting and keep it in a locked up room for only them to enjoy. The nefarious kind of Dr. No like character with a secret lair of his, to keep his stolen collection in. And yes, sure, maybe there are very, 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 very occasional stories of that in the history of art crime, but really it's more of a Hollywood concoction than anything. Or maybe they're just really good at hiding things, and that's why we don't know about more of them. Meanwhile, as you can see here from this cartoon, the newspapers were having a field day with the story, with cheeky cartoons and headlines, and letters flooded the newspaper offices. So Constance Little of Swan Reach wrote in, "Congratulations to those responsible for the removal of the weeping women from the art gallery. This monstrosity should never have been purchased in the first place. May it never return." Veronica McPhail of Bentley East wrote, "Good riddance to that Picasso woman." And Eric Pete of Brighton Beach wrote, "Our hearts bleed for McCackey on his loss of the weeping woman. Never mind. Our latest granddaughter was born last Thursday. She will, I am sure, be able to produce a suitable replacement within 3 or 4 years at the least." So the gloves are coming off in Australia. And while some wrote letters, others focused on the ransom letter at hand. Melbourne's Herald newspaper reported that they had contacted a handwriting expert in Sydney, and they had analyzed the ransom envelope. And here's the envelope so you can follow along. From this, the graphologist concluded that the writer was gay, but of unknown gender, and was a non-secretive loner. They were nervous, depressed, moody, and had low self-esteem that hadn't been alleviated by the theft. Which I would love to know how they came about those conclusions. But in the midst of the brouhaha that McCackey portentously predicted in an earlier clip, artists did what artists do. They made art about the incident. So one of these artists was Juan de Vida, a Chilean-Australian artist who migrated to Melbourne in the 1970s. And he created an exact copy, he said, of The Weeping Woman, which he offered to the NGV for free, saying that because of his masterful copy, there would be no need to keep looking for the original, and suggested that instead, McCackey should focus his attention on the plight of these young contemporary artists in Australia, which had been ignored for too long. And while he waited for the NGV's reply, Davila exhibited his copy at a gallery in Sydney, where it too was promptly stolen within days of the NGV theft. Thieves smashed a glass window at the gallery to steal the copy and left a note. And it too was signed by the ACT. But the thieves of this one clarified their ACT stood for Artists Confronting Terrorism, not the Australian Cultural Terrorists. And this was another version that Juan de Villa did many years later. De Villa has work at the MoMA in New York and the Tate Modern in London. And so he created this version in 1991. And as you can see, he's taken some creative liberties here. She has stubble on her chin and lips. She has a mouth full of broken and gold-capped teeth. Her green skin is somehow even more jaundiced than the original. And a plaque on her frame reads puto, which, as I understand it, is a Spanish insult that generally refers to a male prostitute. And Davila said he meant that for both Picasso and Patrick McKechnie. On the other side of the country in Perth, an artist and gallery owner named Andrew Cooper was arrested after he was spotted walking down the street with the weeping woman under his arm and taking it to a coffee shop named Picasso's. He was immediately surrounded by 10 police officers and questioned for 2 hours before police determined that Cooper's copy still had wet paint on it. So probably it wasn't the 50-year-old masterpiece. And then there was this in Adelaide.
Great Picasso caper. It's been going on in Melbourne for 8 traumatic days. But today, dramatically, the focus of the search switched to Adelaide. ABC News has received a tip-off from an anonymous postman that Picasso is being held at Adelaide's Experimental Art Foundation. In the best tradition of ABC News, we're hot on the trail. Using our usual tactics, we stormed into the building. Yes, this was the place, but we had to take it carefully. The cultural terrorists could have planned an ambush. But no, we were safe. And there it was. I mean, there they were, no fewer than 19 weeping women, which, if any, were real. This problem also confronted the members of the Special Crime Squad. They'd been called in on the request of the Victorian Major Crime Squad. Believe it or not, this was their best lead for the day.
In my opinion, no, I don't think Picasso was there.
In fact, the pieces were all painted by young Adelaide artists wishing to draw attention to the issues raised by the theft, like just how much money is spent on foreign art.
There are also a number of other questions about the extent to which this is going to send in, presumably the insurance rates for art galleries through the roof, and it's going to use up even more rather than the maintenance of those institutions.
Of course, the real painting wasn't here. These are just replicas, but there was that smell of kerosene.
I loved so much about that video, like the japery of the journalist who was, clearly having a great time. And of course, that woman's hair that was interviewed at the end. I mean, she is a work of art in and of herself. Naturally, that show in Adelaide led to a rumor that the real weeping woman was amongst the 28 copies. So a week after the theft and 4 days after the first missive, that's 4 days into the week-long deadline, the ACT sent a second ransom letter dated August 9th. And they wrote, "Good luck with your huffing and puffing, minister, you pompous fathead. If our demands have not been met, you will begin the long process of carrying about you the smell of kerosene and burning canvas." The letter went on to say that the ACT wanted most to return the painting after their demands for increased arts funding were met. Grace Matthews remained unmoved, and he assured the public that they would not negotiate with terrorists. The Victorian government was offering an award of $50,000 for information leading to the arrest of the perpetrators, but notably not for the return of the painting. The museum conducted a second rigorous search of the NTV after this, hoping that the ACT had changed their minds and re-hidden the painting in the galleries. And in their second search, they even drained the moat surrounding the museum, but no luck. 2 days later, a third and final letter arrived at Reese Matthews' office. It was short and sweet. The letter read, "Thank you for your support. Phase 2 begins shortly." Inside the envelope, a single burnt match. It seemed that the Australian cultural terrorists had done as they promised to do. They had burned the Picasso. And that is the end. No, I'm kidding. It's not over yet. Nearly 3 weeks went by after that final missive with the burnt match. But on August 19th, again, just so close, 2 days shy of August 21st, the day that the Mona Lisa and the Duke of Wellington were stolen in their respective years, Patrick McCackey received a call from the Age newspaper, and they had gotten a buzz just a few minutes before. And a man on the phone said, "The painting is returned, locker 227 at Spencer Street." And when the newspaper reporter asked who it was, the man replied, "Why, it's the Australian cultural terrorists. You remember us. Ta-ta." And I just love that he said ta-ta. So after hearing from the newspaper, McCackey rushed to Spencer Street Railway Station, now Southern Cross Station, if you're familiar with Melbourne. And as McCackey sped into the station, a traveler recognized McCackey's, signature bow tie and pocket square and yelled, "Have you found her yet?" And he replied, "Oh, I hope so." And with police in front of locker number 227, McCackey said, "Oh, I wonder if she is in there. I wonder. I can't hear her or anything." The shift station master at Spencer Street said there was no record kept of who was using any of the lockers. Anyone who wanted to could just use a locker for 10 cents, and they would keep the locker's key. All lockers were cleared at night, meaning that the package must have been left there yesterday. Forensic specialists dusted the outside of the locker for fingertips, but said it was too greasy for fingertips to show. But the locker was finally open, and inside was a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a string. It looked suspiciously like the same dimensions as the weeping woman. But the NGV wasn't taking any chances, and they weren't going to celebrate anything until it was unquestionably proven to be their Picasso. The chief conservator was given the package at the station and rushed back to his labs, where he confirmed at 2 a.m. that it was the stolen Picasso. The painting was in perfect condition, furthering the theory that someone familiar with the art had stolen it. The specialized screwdriver used to remove the painting, the registration card left at the scene of the crime, the clear care of the painting were all clues that the Picasso thief or thieves had been one of us, an inside job from inside the art world itself. The next morning, champagne flowed freely as the weeping woman was returned to the walls of the museum. And at a press conference, McCackey said this:
"Going to be bolted to the wall and placed behind glass. If you want to take the train next time, you will have to take the entire air conditioning duct."
So you'll have to take the whole air conditioning duct if you want to steal it next time. So who did it? Forensic tests on the locker went nowhere. A traveler at the train station thought they had seen 2 women lurking around locker number 227, and a sketch was made of the possible ACT actors. It didn't lead anywhere, but again, love that 1980s hair. Many years after the theft, in 2003, McCackey published his memoir, The Bright Shapes and the True Names. And in it, he says he received a call from an art dealer in Melbourne at the time of the theft, who said they suspected a young local artist might know something. And when McCackey visited the artist, the artist feigned disinterest, saying they, barely even remembered that the painting had been stolen. But the artist's walls told a different story, as McCaughey recalls that his walls were pasted with news clippings about the theft. Ever the cool character, McCaughey says he nonchalantly mentioned twice that if someone were interested in returning the painting but not being convicted, then they could just deposit it in a luggage locker at Spencer Street Railway Station or at Tullamarine Airport. And as we now know, 48 hours later, the painting was dropped off at a luggage locker at Spencer Street. So was the young artist the theft? Had he passed the word along? No one knows, or at least there hasn't been any convictions, though the former chief conservator at the NGV said in 2016 about who the thieves were, quote, "Everyone knows, but no one agreed." I'll give the last word on this matter to the Australian cultural terrorist who did send a final letter to Race Matthews. I'll read the most choice parts, as most of it are searing burns, Race Matthews, including comparing him to a blancmange, which is a traditionally white, wobbly, gelatinous cold pudding. Race Matthews, dearest. Our intention was always to bring to public attention the plight of a group which lacks any of the legitimate means of blackmailing governments. If we have also drawn attention to your own inadequacy when faced with a situation requiring any show of intelligence or resource, so much the better. We remain at large and your very humble savants, parentheses, men of learning, Australian cultural terrorists. And I just want to point out that the parenthetical part defining savants is the ACT's distinction, not mine. I know we all know what savants means here because we are savants. But those Australian cultural terrorists, they just could not help themselves with getting one last dig in at Race Matthews. They really had to. That commentary in the last ransom letter about using the theft to bring attention to a group artist who lacked any legitimate means of blackmailing the government harkens back to other art thefts in the history of art crime, like Kempton Bunton, who used the Duke of Wellington to petition for free television licenses for old age pensioners in 1951, or Mario Roemans, who stole Vermeer's Love Letter from Beaux-Arts in Brussels to try to raise money for the Bangladeshi refugees in the Bangladeshi Liberation War in 1971. Another parallel in the history of art crime is that before the Mona Lisa was stolen, she wasn't anywhere close to the global sensation that she has become. And that theft really catapulted her into fame. And though the NGV's Weeping Woman doesn't have the same icon status that the Mona Lisa has, it is, according to a 2011 poll, the fourth most popular piece of the NGV. And it ended up being a great investment. For all of its critics, $2 million in 1985 has turned into an estimated value of $100 million today, which means that McCaughey made a pretty sound investment. Picasso is often attributed with saying, quote, "Good artists copy, great artists steal." And even though this quote probably didn't come from him and it's something that Steve Jobs of all people made up, but even if Picasso did say it, there have been endless variations through time. Most notably, T.S. Eliot wrote in the 1920s, quote, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal." But who really knows who started saying that? It's been stolen beyond recognition. But by this logic, good artists copy, great artists steal. And I think we can agree the Australian cultural terrorists are great artists, though it's not really something any of them are putting on their resumes to this day, as the case remains unsolved. So why is the NGV's woman weeping? Whatever the reason, with all that she has been through, I think we can all agree she deserves a good cry. Thank you for having me. I do want to mention maybe two more things while I have your attention. I have been working on a book. I finished it just like a month ago. It will be out in September of 2024. Prestel is an imprint of Penguin Random House, so it should be available anywhere you find, hopefully your favorite bookstore or wherever you find and order books. So if you liked any of these stories, there's just a bunch more stories in there. It's just all stories of art crime. And I would love if you wanted to be in touch, if you want to geek out about anything art crime, or Eva Marie mentioned that if you have any questions, you're welcome to send them to her, and then she in turn will send them to me, and I will very happily answer those. But thank you so much. It was really fun to get to share this with you, and I hope to meet you in person someday. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful presentation. I mean, gosh, so much to take in.
It was a bit of whiplash. Sorry. I like to say that lecturing is lecturing in museums are as close to like time travel as we can get. We just can bounce all around, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just have a few questions to kind of get the students also thinking. Because I found it really interesting that the government had put up the money. Is that something that is a common occurrence? Because I mean, we don't hear about it here in the US, although I know we have different groups, like the Endowment of the Arts and such. So I guess that would be our arm, but in a country as small as Australia, I mean, that could be a big chunk of a budget.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is more common in other places besides the US. There's kind of US museums are distinct around the world for having so many, like private collections, right, that are funded by citizens. Though we do have some public collections where, public money is used, like the Smithsonian, National Gallery, a portrait gallery, things like that. But even then, it's not the government paying for, an entire painting. There's like many sources flowing into that. So, yes, in other countries, not as shocking or unusual as it would be here.
Excellent. Well, I guess let's start just even from the beginning. What drew you to this story?
I thought the thieves were so cheeky, to use a good Austrian, cheeky buggers. And I just, and they're bordering, I mean, not even bordering, like they're and mean, like they're like cheeky and mean.
Yes.
And I just found it to be, I love narrative. As a researcher, I use narrative methods. And so to me, the shortest point between two people is a story. And so I really gravitate towards the stories in art crime. And this is just such a good story, you couldn't make it up. Like, it's just so good how
I mean, I feel like, especially with the music, that one clip, I mean, it was like watching a movie, and with the SWAT thing. I think that was a thing of SWAT or something. Yes,
totally. Yes, yeah. I love that clip. You can tell they're just having such a good time.
Definitely. Well, and then I just love when they went to room, and it's not just one, but it was all those, women. I'm like, you can't that up, right?
Exactly. Exactly. And you just have to love that, like, that's what artists do, right? Like they're gonna make art about it. And yeah, I love that they did not disappoint.
Yes, not at all. But
Mhm.
in that same clip, I think it was the women, of course, the hair, 80s hair.
Yeah.
She did bring up a good point about the frustration
Yeah.
with a country bringing in foreign art. When we think about museums, well, I'll just go to the Getty because we're
Yeah.
both familiar with it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, all the foreign art that's in that collection. I mean, what are your thoughts about that in looking at how museums, or shall I also add what they need to acquire to stay in business,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, I lived in Australia for like a year and a half in 2014, 2015, and was a education curator at a contemporary arts museum in Perth, where that guy was walking down the street with a wet copy of The Weeping Woman. And I think things have changed a lot in Australia since this theft, and they are really, I would say, a model country for other places. They do a great job, a better job. I don't know if any place is going to get like an A+ exemplary rating for supporting young, contemporary artists, but they do a really good job there, and a really good job of supporting Indigenous artists as well, and Indigenous culture. So that is, something I think we can all learn from. And in terms of, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Oh, I thought you were just going to say something. And, yeah, I think museums really need to, a lot of museums, not everyone, but a lot of museums need to take a hard look at their mission. And these museums that are so stuck to collecting only certain things, it's I think it's really gonna be hard for them to move forward.
Yeah, and it reminds me, I just remember at the Getty, and I know many of the students, you all have been to Getty, they have the exhibition space upstairs. And I remember going in there for exhibition when it's coming out. It was an event showcasing, I think it was youth photography and art, and all the walls were blasted with images of all these different photography and works of art from high school students around. I mean, it was so uplifting, and I think that is the Getty pivoting, to create a space, for, in this case, young local artists.
That's awesome. Yeah, invigorating the space with some new energy. That's really great. Yeah, when I was there in September, I loved seeing, like, I forget the name of the artist, but it was a piece with giant, like, seashells in the lobby.
Oh, yes. And that yes. Oh,
yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
But you stare at it every time you go there, and it's like, oh, yes.
But little things like that, those really do matter, those little pivots.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. So now here's like, I guess, a big question,
Okay.
that we can close out our time together. Is there one theft case that if you could explore and have all the resources that you would just like want to dive into?
Oh yeah. Great question. Let me go through my Rolodex.
Or maybe 2 or 3. I mean, I don't want to put on the spot.
I love this one because it's unsolved. So I would love to, figure it out. Even if I did figure it out, I'm not sure I would tell the world because it's just kind of better not to know. But I will say, because I became a Canadian citizen this year, my husband's Canadian, there was a theft from the La Musée des Beaux-Arts in Montreal in the 70s. It's called the Skylight Caper is what they call it there. And it too remains unsolved. And it has, I mean, the pieces were not that were stolen, and there were dozens that were stolen, were not of the same value as the Isabella Stewart Gardner theft in 1991, but it just dropped off the map, you know, like it just feels like no one is even trying to figure out where those works of art are or who did it. Whereas like the Isabella Stewart Gardner, I mean, I think the FBI knows at this point like who did it, and they were still really hoping that those pieces come home. But so I guess I would say the new Canadian in me would say that, and then of course the American in me would say the Gardner theft. You know, that is just that we want that Vermeer back, that only seascape.
The Rembrandt.
I mean, it's just yeah.
Well, and
One.
well, no, I would say the Gardner. I mean, just because in my little research, I haven't delved deeply, but I mean, you know, the perpetrators, you know, it's all, they have a little comedy in there, you know, with how they kind of went about it, and even how they went when they did, you know, St. Patrick's Day late in the morning and all that.
Yeah, with fake mustaches.
Yes. It is, and what's amazing in today's time with everything in the internet and how the world really is close. I mean, it's not as vast as we think it is because of technology and communications. We haven't heard anything about that art, even still.
Yeah.
I mean, sadly, yes, tear, because
Yeah.
I love that Rembrandt.
We're both weeping women.
Yeah,
now.
we're like, oh, because we know, dear. But in any case, thank you so much. And again, students, you will have the opportunity to submit your Q&As just like normal, and I will email them to Dr. Evans, and then I will post her response to all the questions in our Canvas module. Okay. So again, thank you for a great lecture.
Thank you so much. It was it's always so fun for me to get to tell stories about art crime. So thank you for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. All right, students, I hope you thoroughly enjoyed the lecture with Dr. Evans. Very entertaining, I should say, and I do like how she took us full circle. I'm going to give you just a few moments right now as we're closing out our time together. If you would like to submit a question that I will take to Dr. Evans for sure. And then as a reminder that you can always continue the conversation in a discussion amongst the students, amongst you and your peers. And then also, if you could leave a summary, or rather your impressions, you know, what are 3 takeaways that you took from this lecture and you would share with somebody who wasn't able to be here today. So again, thank you, and look forward to another interesting lecture. Next week, we will actually have the Dean of Humanities from the University of California, Irvine. So looking forward to hearing from him. All right, my friends, have a great day, and I look forward to your questions. And we'll see you next Friday. Take care.